and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akeridoluale. The headlines. Rockets hit the city of Zaporizhzhia in southern Ukraine this morning. Vladimir Putin arrives at meeting with leaders of former Soviet states in Kazakhstan. Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell promises powerful response against Russia in case of nuclear attack on Ukraine. A warm welcome once again. A rocket had hit the city of Zaporizhzhia in southern Ukraine this morning, according to Telegram posts from the head of the Zaporizhzhia Regional Military Administration and the city's acting mayor. Anatoly Kutev, acting mayor, says, quote, the enemy has attacked Zaporizhzhia and infrastructure in one of the city's districts was destroyed. Mr. Kutev says rescue teams have responded to the site of the attack. However, neither official said whether any casualties were reported. In the meantime, Russian President Vladimir Putin has arrived at the Commonwealth of Independent States Leaders meeting in Astana, Kazakhstan. According to the RIA Novosti, Mr. Putin arrived at the meeting venue earlier on today, where talks have begun between leaders from Azerbaijan, Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Earlier on in the week, Mr. Putin attended the conference on interaction and conference-building measures in Asia in Astana as well. In his remarks at that summit, he had said, together with other Asian countries, Russia was looking to form a, quote, system of equal and indivisible security based on the universally recognized principles of international law of the UN Charter. Mr. Putin did not, however, reference the war in Ukraine in his remarks. And over 200 volunteer fighters have been recruited to the Pseudo-Platov battalion in Russian-controlled Zaporizhzhia, and that's according to the Russian-installed leader of the region. According to Yevgeny Balitsky, the recruits to the Russian-backed forces are undergoing training on a military base not far from Melitopol, a city in the south. Balitsky said more than 600 people had applied, adding that, quote, there are different reasons why people have not been selected to be part of a battalion yet, but there are more applicants than those who have been selected already. United Nations nuclear watchdog chief Rafael Grossi says he had raised the issue of the detained deputy head of Zaporizhzhia's nuclear power plant with the Russian authorities. Speaking during a visit to Kiev, Mr. Grossi says the detention of the plant's deputy director, Valery Marchinuk, was unacceptable. Mr. Grossi had visited Kiev and St. Petersburg in recent days in an attempt to get a demilitarized zone agreed. Staying with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the head of the UN's nuclear watchdog has said that progress is being made towards establishing a safety zone around the Russian-occupied power station in Ukraine. Mr. Grossi, the IAEA Director General, shared photographs on social media of a meeting with Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba in Kiev, saying, quote, we are making progress towards establishing a protection zone around Europe's largest nuclear power plant. However, he added that the situation continues to be extremely fragile, extremely precarious. In a tweet, Mr. Kuleba had said he had reiterated that Russia must withdraw from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant to ensure its safety and security, immediately stop abductions and intimidation of the Ukrainian personnel when he met with the authorities earlier. Let's talk now to Stephen Hayes. Mr. Stephen Hayes is the president of Cohen and Woods International. He joins us virtually. Good morning to you, Stephen. Nice to see you once again.
Thank you, Lottie. It's good to see you again. Obviously, under better circumstances, it would be nice, but it's nice to see you again.
Indeed, indeed, better circumstances would be nice. One would have expected by now we wouldn't be talking about this crisis anymore, but yet here we are. I wonder if you look at this as some sort of the word I'm looking for actually is long-drawn battle of attrition. There are those who have talked about the fact that the overall goal for the Western allies is wearing Russia's military capability down. But it doesn't seem as if that is yet achieved, even though the Ukrainians are on the military offensive. What do you make about what has happened so far?
I think you're right that it's going to be a war of attrition on both sides, but I think I see it more in the Russian history of a chess game, and Putin in some ways I think is playing a very smart chess game of moving pieces. Diversion, the meetings in Kazakhstan, for instance, the new alliances that he's trying to build, particularly with Turkey and so forth. So I think it's becoming increasingly complex. We're not close to the end game of a chess game, and I think that there is still too much ahead. It also shows that it's a lot easier to start a war than get out of one. But I think even with the annexation, so-called annexations, I think it's also really more a strategic game, much like chess, that those regions are essential to Russian security as Putin sees it right now. So it's a very complex chess game to me.
Let me take you away from the battlefront and come to the geopolitics of this, if you like. This has become about energy and energy security and energy supplies and the prices of energy worldwide. That's the one thing that seems to cut across everybody, including the West. In the U.S., where you are, we've seen significant rises in the price of energy, and that has fed into some level of the domestic politics. And then when OPEC Plus, which incidentally includes Russia, then cut supply by more than 2 million barrels, the United States was very upset, particularly with Saudi Arabia, which was the other main player in that decision. Do you think that perhaps this may be, following what happened with Jamal Khashoggi's murder earlier on, this might be some kind of a breaking point in Saudi-U.S. relations, especially because the administration is looking towards the midterm elections next month?
I don't think it's a breaking point. I think it's more I'd call it a tipping point, but not yet a breaking point. And I say that because, again, Iran. The Iran relationship is important to a number of interests. It's certainly important positively to Russia, but it is also important in a different way to the United States. And Saudi Arabia plays a key role in that. So you can't really pull away from Saudi Arabia if Iran is seen as the main opponent. However, I think that the general public sentiment is increasingly anti-Saudi Arabia, certainly to the government of Saudi Arabia. But talk is easy, and what we actually do about it's another question. And I think that's the question that just is not answered yet.
In terms of the politics, there's quite a lot going on. I mean, you've just responded to the U.S., Saudi, Russia, Iran complication there. On the other hand, you have the China, Taiwan, U.S. relations, which have suddenly come to the front as a result of what Russia did or is doing in Ukraine, because the Chinese have said, look, Taiwan is part of China. The U.S. had remained ambiguous, but more recently, you have President Biden becoming a bit more forceful in saying that if Taiwan was to be attacked by China, the United States will come to its defense. Now, if you have that on one hand and you have the ongoing crisis on the other hand, could that be a bit too much for the parties involved to be doing at the same time, particularly in the case of the U.S.?
It seems too much to me, but we have fought two front wars in the past. But I still think that China has played this very well, in the sense of certainly they've intimidated Taiwan, but they haven't taken that step. They've always said since 1947 that Taiwan is part of China. So there's nothing new on that front. How aggressive the Chinese government wants to become is the question. I still think they've been relatively, in this whole overall picture, relatively restrained. Not nearly as much as I would say in the past, and certainly there's a lot of saber rattling, probably a little too much on both sides. And then the unknown factor again in the Pacific is Japan. It's a major player in the whole Pacific rim as well, and they are feeling more and more intimidated, particularly when the Russian ally of North Korea and somewhat the ally of China fires missiles over there. So we are clearly in an extremely dangerous period. That's just self-evident.
You've again linked quite a number of things there. I mean, we started off with the Russia, Iran, U.S., Saudi. Mm-hmm. We've gone to the China, Taiwan, U.S. part of it. Now we're coming to North Korea, Japan, South Korea, and again the United States. We do have, in the case of China, a country that has significant resources, much more significant than Russia. By some estimates, China has the biggest navy in the world now, and it has more than 2.5 million people in its armed forces. So it's about the only country that could come anywhere close to the United States in terms of military power. But as you said, it's moving very, very slowly and carefully. But it does seem as if the United States, on the other hand, whether it wants to move slowly or not, is being dragged in several directions. And President Biden, who started off his term in office not wanting to get into any more foreign entanglements, is having no choice in the matter.
There is no choice. We are part of NATO. The Ukraine situation is affecting NATO, so we're dragged into that whether we like it or not. The situation with China and our statements on Taiwan, I think we need to be very careful in honoring those agreements, is inevitably dragging the U.S. back in. And of course, Japan, we have been responsible really for the defense of Japan since the end of World War II. So that also is inevitably bringing the United States back into the picture. I think the real card too, as you earlier stated, is the energy situation. Energy has played to Putin's hands so far, but I think that's not inevitable, but that's certainly going to play a big role on public opinion.
Let me bring you, I mean, you have been very well involved, deeply involved in trade and such issues, associated issues worldwide, including on the African continent. How much of an impact do you think all these various crises, starting from the war in Ukraine and indeed all the other geopolitical connections, have had on economic matters, particularly trade between countries, both in terms of stability, in terms of prices, and in terms of possibly opportunities?
On one hand, it's surprising how much trade is continuing under the circumstances. Certainly, we still have, China is still a major trading partner for us, even with the rhetoric and the saber rattling going on. It's certainly, I think, increased I think the war is increasing trade possibilities, but it's also decreasing real trade. Particularly, I think Africa is going to be hurt quite a bit, if it's not already being hurt by trade. I think there's also going to be a return in some ways to the old Cold War models of trying to get different countries in Africa to align with either Russia or China or the United States. And I think that's very, very unfortunate. So I think all this is going to have an impact on trade. Whether it's going to be positive or not, I'm not sure. I think that my internal feeling is that it's going to be more negative than positive, but you have to continue to trade to maintain economies or, in fact, if you like, maintain war machines. So I think there's going to be a push to continue trade. I think it's going to be very, very difficult.
Now, one of the neck of the woods worldwide that you've also been extremely active and where you have a lot of information and connections is in the former Soviet states. We talked about that at the very beginning of our conversation when you mentioned that Putin has been putting together these alliances with several groups of countries. Right now, he is in Astana in Kazakhstan meeting with the former Soviet countries. But I assume that that would, of course, be several countries, not including Ukraine, Poland, and the others who have joined NATO and the EU. But there are a couple of other countries. Now, do you think that economically, is it viable for Russia to develop more close, shall we say, trade and economic ties with this Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and the others, the stands that were formerly in the Soviet Union?
Oh, definitely. It's definitely viable. But those same countries that are mentioned in that meeting don't necessarily work well with one another. Armenia and Azerbaijan being two of the strongest examples of that. But historically they were related. Whether they liked it or not is another issue. But historically they were related to the old Soviet Union. And those relationships have continued. A lot of the older relationships, my generation dying out, but there's new, younger relationships. So I think that alliance, let me say, I think will be more of an economic alliance than it will a military. But Putin's trying to, of course. Obviously, as you mentioned, or the newscast mentioned, looking at security. And there is an interest in that, but I think that's going to be harder to keep together than an economic alliance and trade alliance.
Let's look at Europe. I mean, we've talked about, you mentioned Africa, we've just talked about the Soviet states. Let's come to Europe. The issue in Europe is that most of the countries in Europe, at least publicly, are behind Ukraine. They're supporting Ukraine, some of them with armaments, others with training and money and humanitarian aid and all of that. But there have been countries within Europe that have continued to, knock the drums of dialogue. One prominent person in that regard has been President Emmanuel Macron of France, who, in spite of being at the end of quite a lot of negative comments, has continued to say, look, you've got to talk to Vladimir Putin if this is going to end. We cannot pretend as if we can ignore him and come to some kind of agreement without him. On the other hand, you have the likes of the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has also played a key role in trying to bring about some kind of dialogue. Do you think that these two people may have some success in spite of the overwhelming opinion against any kind of dialogue or any kind of accommodation with Russia?
To me, Turkey is more the wild card than France. I think Putin's putting a lot of emphasis on the relationship with Turkey. He has to do that for the defense, but and also it's a weak link in NATO too. I think it's perceived. Europe has hardened in part because of the aggressions and the increasing aggression in Ukraine, and how long Europe continues that way will depend on the energy question and how well they get through the winter. But Turkey clearly has a very strong hand in this. How much leadership wants to play in Turkey, play that hand, and how much it wants to antagonize the U.S., I don't know. But right now, it's probably the best bridge between Russia and the United States and Europe.
Let me ask you, and because you mentioned that in the answer towards the end of your answer just now, and that is the coming winter. So many people have said, look, all this is good. We can argue back and forth about the philosophical underpinnings and what needs to be done containment and all that. But if it comes to light that people are actually, in some countries, going to be at the wrong end of the stick of the coming winter, either as a result of shortage of supplies or being unable to afford the supplies. We can already see what's going on in the UK. Do you perhaps see the possibility of a public swing against this war in some of those countries, even including in the United States?
I think there's going to be growing discontent, whether it's a swing towards Russia in that regard. I'm not so certain, and I'm a little doubtful. I think people will maintain, but they maintain the stance on Russia. But they're going to put a lot of pressure on their own leadership for energy supplies. So that indirectly then will certainly benefit Russia. In some ways, it's going to depend on whether we have a Russian winter, which has saved Russia in the past, the Napoleon era, World War II. The Russian winter has saved the country. Now, will that affect the relationships again? We'll see. If global warming and we have has its effect on a warmer winter, then it's going to be a little easier on Europe. So it's what's interesting is how interrelated everything is now. The natural systems as well as the political systems, and it's just all going to have various degrees of determination on what happens in the future.
Finally, Stephen, before I let you go, I must ask about this. The U.S. midterms usually, even without all of what we've discussed, are usually pretty rough on the governing party, the party that is in the White House. In this case, we're talking about the Democrats, and the Republicans have their own problems with all the issues with President Trump, former President Trump, and all of that. But do you think this war in Ukraine and all the associated issues that we've discussed could have some bearing, if not a lot of bearing, on what the results would be come November 4?
Overall, almost all U.S. elections come down to local issues or national issues. How much Ukraine affects, I don't know. It's just this election is the hardest, I think, that we've had in a long time to determine how it will unfold. On one week, it looks very, very much like the Democrats will be in better shape than predicted. And then, you see one great gaffe and a mood swing. I think it's going to be extremely close all the way across the country. This country is badly divided in some ways, and I think we're going to need new, younger leadership that can bring it back together. But that's not going to happen, between now and November. It's going to take place over time. So I can't give you any predictions on this election. I would like to feel that I know how it's going to end, and quite frankly, I feel that I've been accurate in the past, but this one's just too hard to determine where it goes. And how much Ukraine plays, I think, will probably be minimal. It may make a difference in some areas, but most of the elections are all local and national.
Indeed. We wish you well. Stephen Hayes, President of Cohen and Woods International, thank you for your time, and I hope you do have a warmer winter than most as it comes to light. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Vladimir. Thank you. It's an honor, as usual. Thank you.
And after the break, IMF meetings marked by growing push to end war in Ukraine. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Hundreds of Ukrainian protesters gathered in front of NATO headquarters as ministers of defense from the alliance met to discuss support for Ukraine. Protesters chanted for air defense systems and ammunition in response to the bombing of many Ukrainian cities since Monday. They also chanted for heavy weapons and tanks. Signs denounced the Russian invasion and called on NATO allies to arm Ukrainian troops.
So we came all here together to let the people inside, behind the fence, to let them know that we need some weapons, because that's the only way we can stop the war. Stop the war by winning the war and putting Putin in jail?
Well, I would just say surrender and leave my country alone. You have so much in Russia to develop. Enjoy, develop your own country. Leave Ukraine alone. In 2022, it's not the time to conquer the territories. Russia have everything. So for me, just leave Ukraine alone and focus on your own country. I'm sure there is a lot to develop there.
And EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell has promised that any nuclear attack on Ukraine would prompt a response from the country's Western allies that would annihilate the Russian army. Russian President Vladimir Putin had threatened the use of nuclear weapons since his military was beaten back on several fronts in Ukraine over the past month, and Russia proclaimed the annexation of Ukrainian territories.
And then there is the nuclear threat. And then there is the nuclear threat. And Putin is saying that he's not bluffing. Well, he cannot afford bluffing. He cannot afford bluffing. And it has to be clear that the people who support Ukraine and the European Union and the member states and the US and NATO are not bluffing neither. And any nuclear attack against Ukraine will create an answer. Not a nuclear answer, but such a powerful answer from the military side that the Russian army will be annihilated, and Putin should not be bluffing.
And the circumstances in which NATO might have to use nuclear weapons are, quote, extremely remote. And that's according to the Western Alliance's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. He adds, however, that there would be severe consequences if Russia used such weapons.
Circumstances in which NATO might have to use nuclear weapons are extremely remote. Russia's nuclear rhetoric is dangerous, reckless, and they know that if they use nuclear weapon against Ukraine, it will have severe consequences, and they also know that a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. And we will not go into exactly how we will respond, but of course this will fundamentally change the nature of the conflict. It will mean that a very important line has been crossed. Even any use of a smaller nuclear weapon will be a very serious thing, fundamentally changing the nature of the war in Ukraine, and of course that will have consequences, and Russia knows there will be consequences. NATO and NATO allies, we have very good intelligence. We are working hard. We have monitored Russian nuclear forces for decades, and of course we will continue to monitor them very closely, and we will stay vigilant. Also when they now start a new exercise. What I can say is that this exercise, the Russian exercise, is an annual exercise. It's an exercise where they test and exercise their nuclear forces. We will monitor that, as we always do, and now support the ongoing.
Thank you very much.
And Ukraine's top prosecutor says his office has opened criminal proceedings relating to Russian missile strikes that struck Kiev and cities across Ukraine this week. Speaking at a joint news conference with International Criminal Court prosecutor Karim Khan in The Hague, Prosecutor General Andrei Koshtin described the strikes since Monday, October the 10th, as, quote, a classic act of terror by Russia. He says more than 112 Russian missile strikes, Moscow's biggest aerial offensive since the start of its invasion on February 24th, had killed 17 people and injured 93.
Humanitarian catastrophe. Only at the start of this week, on Monday, Russia launched a massive missile attack, sent more than 112 missiles on Kyiv, Zaporizhzhia, Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, other cities and towns all over Ukraine, which killed at least 17 people and injured 93. These shelling have no military purpose. The goal of Russia's deliberate attacks is to cause civilian deaths and to destroy civilian infrastructure by shortage of electricity and heating, provoke humanitarian catastrophe. Coupled with the intimidation tactics against civilians, it's a classical act of terror prohibited under international law. So all of the hits of every missile, every drone, every damage of civil infrastructure, every person, Ukrainian, who was killed or wounded by this missile attack, all of them are documented and criminal proceedings were registered and opened.
Missiles exploded near the central market in Kupiansk, a town in northeastern Kharkiv province, from which Russian troops were driven in late September by a Ukrainian counteroffensive that has pushed into the neighboring Luhansk region. The missiles destroyed and damaged shops, carpeting streets and sidewalks in glass shards, rubble and twisted metal sheets. Meanwhile, President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused the International Committee of the Red Cross of inaction in upholding the rights of Ukrainian prisoners of war and urged it to undertake a mission to a camp in the Russian-occupied east of the country. In his usual nightly video message, Mr. Zelensky says no one had yet visited Olenivka, a notorious camp in eastern Ukraine, where dozens of Ukrainian prisoners of war died in an explosion and fire in July. His comments were the latest of a series of Ukrainian criticisms of the ICRC. Mr. Zelensky's chief of staff separately issued an ultimatum to the ICRC to launch a mission within 3 days, or Kiev authorities would do it themselves. However, there was no one available from the ICRC for comment. And United States Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin says that Russia has made a choice to attack Ukraine and could resolve the conflict by withdrawing. Speaking at a news conference after a NATO meeting in the Belgian capital, Brussels, General Austin said NATO was more unified than ever. He reiterated NATO's commitment to Ukraine as well as its goal to strengthen NATO's collective defense. General Austin also laid out plans to supply Kiev with further defense systems following days of increased missile strikes across Ukraine.
In the face of Europe's largest security crisis since World War II, NATO stands more unified and more resolute than ever. Today, this proud alliance of free countries stands together to condemn Russia's illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. You know, Putin thought he could easily conquer his peaceful neighbor. Yet the Kremlin's war of choice is now in its 8th month. Putin's mobilization effort, his bellicose rhetoric, his cruel attacks on civilian targets, and his hollow attempt to annex Ukrainian territory all show how Ukraine's courage and skill have disrupted Russia's hope for a quick war of conquest. NATO continues to make clear that we will not be dragged into Russia's war of choice, but we will stand by Ukraine as it fights to defend itself. And we will continue to strengthen NATO's collective defense. I would also say that one change that could be made today is that Russia could choose to de-escalate and could choose to end this war because Putin started this war as a matter of choice.
Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin met with his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan during the meeting of Keka in Kazakhstan's capital, Astana. Bilateral cooperation, energy security, and grain exports were among key issues discussed by both leaders.
Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan met his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in Astana on the sidelines of a conference on interaction and confidence-building measures in Asia. The two leaders sat down for televised talks on several topics, including energy, security, and grain exports. Referring to a UN-brokered export deal agreed in July, Putin said that not enough of the grain was going round the poorest countries. But Erdogan, in return, said low-income nations would be prioritized, adding that Turkey is prepared to help facilitate exports through its ports.
We are determined to strengthen and continue the grain exports under the Istanbul Agreement and the transfer of Russian grain and fertilizer to less developed countries via Turkey. We may work on determining the name of countries as well as conducting export via our country. It is important that we focus on the poor countries rather than the developed ones during this period. I think that doing this will turn many balances in favor of us in the world. The steps that Turkey and Russia will take in this process may disturb certain groups, but make less developed countries grateful.
In the meantime, the Russian president told his Turkish counterpart that Turkey was the most reliable route to deliver gas to the European Union and proposed to build what he called a supply hub there. The proposal comes as Russia looks to maintain its energy leverage over Europe while redirecting supplies away from the Nord Stream Baltic gas pipelines damaged in explosions last month that are still under investigation.
In the course of the work of this hub, which we could create together, of course, it would also be a platform not only for supplies but also for determining the price, because this is a very important issue, the issue of pricing. As for another energy, hydrocarbons, supplies of our hydrocarbons, including gas, are continuing in full flow as per your requests.
Erdogan did not comment on the gas hub idea, but the Turkish president has sought to mediate between Moscow and Kyiv since Putin sent troops to Ukraine on February the 24th.
Let's talk now to security expert, public commentator, Mr. Olade Dario joins me here in the studio. Good morning to you. Thank you for coming in.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So much happening.
At the speed of light.
Yeah, we're seeing President Putin meeting with President Erdogan, meeting with the former Soviet states. Yeah. We're seeing NATO also having a meeting and warning about nuclear weapons. We had the United Nations vote about 24 thereabouts ago. So a lot is happening, but in terms of its impact on what is going on in the battlefield, very little has changed.
In world dynamics, the lowest level of confidence is assumption. Because you will just sit somewhere, do your configurations, and think you are ready, then you launch out. That was a mistake Russia did. If they wanted to canvass a position, pro or against NATO, it shouldn't have taken this dimension. They undermined the capacity of Ukraine to respond. And my pain really is the global media keeps saying war, and it's not a war. It's a pure invasion, because the theater of war remains Ukraine. And I've been wondering why they are not extending the game plan to Russia. Let them feel the impact, no matter how meager, it will shake them. To the point that I even thought when Erdogan met with Putin, of course, that must have been a diplomatic story anyway, that they spoke for 1.5 hours, and there's such an important and current issue like the invasion, what they call special operation, didn't come up. That's not possible. I mean, we're not deceived. But my worry really is, despite the voting, which was very much in favor of Ukraine, there's still no direct road or pathway to peace, reconciliation, and termination of hostilities. And you begin to wonder why. As the world surrendered to Putin, that it can no longer be called to order, it might look like a joke. I told my daughter one day, I said, look, if you are bringing home a husband or a suitor, make sure it's somebody who has someone who can call him to order. Now, there's nobody to call Putin to order. You can imagine a woman marrying a man who can't be called to order. Everything before him will look like battle, and he will see himself as a victor, without respect to anybody. It's unfortunate. And I'm getting worried by the day, because you now ask yourself, where are we going? I'm glad that ICRC has been brought into the picture. There has been very scanty reports on humanitarian issues. All you just hear is they bomb this one, missiles and all of that. What happened to human beings? who are victims of the invasion. You just heard that they said 9 people were killed somewhere, others were injured. Who goes to do the counting? Yeah, because in buildings, imagine a 10-story building brought down. How do you go there and start counting who is dead or lying under the rubble?
So these are at best estimates.
Estimates, which of course
undercounting what is really the tragedy.
Which of course best common sense. We should be looking at bringing this thing to a total close. It's unfortunate. You heard that protester saying that Russia should leave them alone and go and develop this country. Now, with the damage done to Ukraine, it may take more than a decade for them to find their feet. Unfortunately, children, women, the aged people are victims, but nobody is talking about them.
But then that also brings the other side of this, which is that, of course, everybody knows that when you have I don't want to use the word war because you just said
it's not a war,
but
please.
then I want to use war in the sense that when you have antagonists and defenders, this is the result. I mean, people who know nothing about it are usually the victims. A lot of the people...
Collateral damages.
Absolutely. Now, a lot of the people have had to flee. I mean, that's a different breed of people who have had to
Imagine if it happens here now. You will not be here. I won't be here. It's the same thing.
But looking at, I want to focus on that. There we have the picture of the pictures of the protesters who are asking. Incidentally, they are not asking necessarily for peace. What they're asking is for NATO to arm Ukraine to be able to fight better so that they can win.
I understand.
So to some extent, again, as you say, that there doesn't seem to be any drive on either side or on any of the other third parties.
On all sides, including support. And
that's it, for some kind of peace. The person who has come closest to that is the Turkish president, but he seems to have also given
avoided.
That's it. He also seems to even have given up because it doesn't seem as if anybody else is willing to follow him along those lines. So his business now is that he's doing trade, which is why he's meeting Putin, which is why he's meeting the former Soviet states.
Believe that?
So, well, that's what the report
said. Thing. You just showed us that dummy, so we keep talking. Of course, and that's what the world is doing now. My worry basically is that on the street, we say that information is knowledge, knowledge is power.
Yes.
Now, in this case, Russia had knowledge, but they lacked information. What do I mean? Information, now that we are in the information age, easily becomes outdated. If they knew that Ukraine could resist them thus far, I don't think they would have tried this. You can see them now, I mean, trying to preempt him into thinking he should go nuclear. But the reality is, the way nuclear weapon is structured, if you aim at any target, the station too and the environment too, they will carry part of the can. So it's not like you are firing a gun at an opponent. No. But for those thinking in that regard, I still don't understand why. Because they have created another Adolf Hitler now, Adolf Putin, that nobody can manage, nobody can advise or temper. So it's making it look increasingly dicey.
But how do you think that can be approached? Because it does seem as if the United Nations can't do anything because...
I mean, I've told you before that after this, some countries will reconsider their membership of UN. They are paying heavily. And what if this happens to them? Who will defend them? The missing link here now is that there is no peace in the life of Putin. And when you don't have peace in your life, you cannot connect with other people who have peace in their lives. Number two, at any time you see anybody declaring a war or an invasion, sense has taken a flight. So they need to first of all approach him in a manner that will make him realize the wider consequences of what he's doing. He seems to enjoy inflicting pain on Ukraine. Suddenly, they went around the country bombing places. I was glad when I read that they've recovered 600 communities that were hitherto occupied by Russia. But as it is, even in the occupied territory, Kherson, the man they put there as governor is calling Russia to come and evacuate the people. That could be a strategy anyway to paint Ukraine black, because they're now saying those people voted.
They voted to join
become
Russia,
Russians,
and the Ukrainians are now
bombing them. I don't think they will do that. To a large extent, Ukraine has been able to apply sanity in fighting back. Otherwise, they will have crossed the border and start bombing Russian territories as well. Unfortunately, there's no. I can't think of anybody in the world now who I would say they should approach to go and speak to Putin. Maybe the Korean magic man.
or the Chinese president, perhaps.
They are very close. I expect that by now, the Chinese president should have been able to meet Putin one-on-one and appeal to him to see that he is destroying humanity. It is not a personal war. It's not me and that they're fighting now. Even if you had anything against Zelensky, the way it has gone now is destroying a people, a generation. And I told you before that it will end up in ICPC. I'm sorry, ICC is National Criminal Court of Justice. ICC. Yes, it's going to end, and you can already see the moves now. You can't do these things and then get away with it. No.
We'll have to wait and see how that pans out. Mr. Olade, thank you for your time and for your perspective this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. And after the break, Ukrainian rescuers pull boy from rubble after shelling in Mykolaiv. Please join us again. All right, thanks for staying tuned. Laddie Williams, morning. Laddie Williams, of course, is of our business desk. The latest CPI data shows, and I have this written down, red-hot inflation continues to thrive in the U.S. Consumer prices jumped more than 8% in September.
8.2%, and analysts were actually expecting 8.1%, and we saw how everyone was looking forward, holding their breath for that CPI data. So it's out now, and it's hotter than expected. At the end of the day, we know what that means. The Fed, they've said if the inflation rate keeps going up, we're going to keep raising rates, and you know the market doesn't want to hear that. And
so how have the markets reacted?
Well, first, the markets were reacting negatively before the data came out. We saw the NASDAQ, that one dropped about almost 1% in the futures market. We saw Bitcoin drop from about $19,000, it got to about $18,300. Globally, all markets were rattled. But immediately the data came out, we saw the market started jumping again, and Bitcoin now trading about $19,800. So a massive jump. We saw the NASDAQ actually close in the green yesterday. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, S&P 500, all of them closed in the green. Europe, Asia, those markets also jumped, after we got that CPI data. So at the end of the day, some are calling it a relief rally that might not continue, but some are still optimistic that this might be the bottom. But at the end of the day, nobody knows. But we have red-hot data, and obviously the Fed are waiting.
Well, of course, the Fed had been waiting for that to act, and now they're going to act.
Exactly.
Quick one: Europe gas poised for weekly loss as nations fill up stocks.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, we're seeing Europe now. They've filled up about 91% of their storage for gas, and there are also indications for weather forecast for December into February, and it's showing that it might not be as cold. So, that's
good news.
Good news, and that's reducing demand for natural gas. We've seen natural gas actually sold for about $9 last month, but now it's dropped to about $6 this morning. So at the end of the day, sentiment traders, there's not going to be much demand, so they're already dumping, most of all that natural gas that they've bought. Talking about Wall Street, so
yes. So I mean,
so
you bought all that because you thought it was going to go up, and now it's not going up.
It's not going up. The prices are down,
right.
And hopefully the prices keep going down. And at the end of the day, that's good for Europe and Germany. It shows that you know, they don't have to, you know, worry about, you know, gas shortages going forward. So the manufacturers can keep working. The households are okay. They don't pay too much, you know, for gas, since they have, you know, quite a good storage at this time. So it's good news.
Indeed,
really.
indeed. Ladi, you're full of good news today.
It's a Friday.
Makes a good Friday going
exactly.
into the weekend. I hope you have more good news for the viewers. Right after this on Business Morning and indeed on Business Incorporated.
Exactly.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at some of the sport. UEFA President Alexander Seferin has defended the organization's decision not to ban Belarus from qualification for the 2024 European Championships. Belarus was placed in Group 1 of the Euro 2024 qualification draw in Frankfurt, alongside Andorra, Israel, Kosovo, Romania, and Switzerland. Belarus must play home games outside the country and without spectators, but Germany has demanded that UEFA prevent Belarus from taking part in qualification altogether because of the conflict with Ukraine, just as it had done with Russia. Belarus is an ally of Russia in the ongoing military operation in Ukraine, and both countries were the subject of a ban recommendation issued by the International Olympic Committee back in February. Russian Sports Minister Oleg Matysyn has said he is not aware of reported plans to create volunteer military detachments of professional athletes as the nation continues its war against Ukraine. Reports say a preliminary discussion was held on Monday in Moscow, and it was suggested regional sports federations would initially become involved in the mobilization process. However, Mr. Matysyn insisted he had no knowledge of such plans and claimed every person has the right to choose who should serve in its army. An estimated 300,000 reservists are being summoned to join the army, with sporting athletes and coaches amongst the recruits. And finally on the program, footage shows the moment Ukrainian rescue workers pulled a boy from the rubble of a shell-struck building in the southern port city of Mykolaiv. The location of the video was verified by building characteristics which matched file imagery of the area. In a statement released with the video, the 12-year-old boy was trapped for more than 6 hours after his 5-story residential block collapsed in the attack. The State Emergency Service of Ukraine says the boy, named only as Artem, was pulled out and was taken to a medical facility. Mykolaiv's mayor, Alexander Senkovich, says the southern city was massively shelled. Moscow began apparent revenge strikes on Monday after Russian President Vladimir Putin declared a blast on Russia's bridge to Crimea to be a terrorist one. Thanks for being with us. That's our program this morning. My name is Ladi Akiri Doluale. There are updates, as always, throughout the day, and in particular in the world today. Do have yourselves a pleasant weekend ahead. Good morning.